even hippies knew about Jetsun Milarepa because in the 50s and 60s, the most kind of famous books about Tibetan Buddhism in the West were this collection of 4 volumes edited by a fellow called W.Y. Evans Vance, one-time graduate of Oxford University, and altogether interesting chap, I suppose one could say. So one of his 4 volumes, not as famous as the Tibetan book, he didn't translate them, by the way, somebody else did, alongside the Tibetan Book of the Dead, was Tibet's Great Yogi Milarepa. So these 4 volumes were on every kind of discerning hippie's bookshelf. So Milarepa, often pronounced as Milarepa, was known even to hippies. I don't know what you would have thought about that, but anyway. Milarepa was born in 1040 in southern Tibet. At that time, the Dharma was beginning its kind of second phase of transmission from India to Tibet. So he's very much part of that second phase. And the school to which Milarepa, which he was one of the founding fathers, was the Kagyu school, one of the main schools of the later period of Dharma in Tibet. And so you could say that his importance is that one of the founding masters, one of the great lineage holders. He was a disciple of Marpa, who'd been the disciple of Indian tantric masters such as Naropa and Maitrapa. So that legacy of tantric teachings was passed through Milarepa through his disciple Gampopa. So he's remarkable just for the teachings he passed and the practices he did. But also his life story is very, very dramatic and makes him in a way like kind of one of the key figures in Tibetan's own understanding of what the Dharma is. So it's almost like his personality and his struggles, his difficulty in life become archetypal. So people in all the traditions revered him in Tibet, not just the Kagyus. Everybody read Milarepa's life story. Everybody was inspired by him. And that is because, in a way, his story is that of a sinner turned saint, to put it in very cliched terms. Because Milarepa's early life was one of, great tragedy and great mistakes. As I say, he was born in 1040 in southern Tibet. His family were quite wealthy. What tradition did they belong? Well, there weren't really divided traditions at that time in Tibet, but they were certainly Buddhist, and presumably they had contact with the teachings that was around from the earlier period, from the Nyingma period. And so Milarepa did learn some Dharma even as a child. But then tragedy happened to his family. His father died, leaving his mother and he and his sister to the tender mercies of their relatives, who managed to swindle them of all their inheritance and reduce them to penury and not slavery, but certainly servitude. So Milarepa's mother, in a way, understandably, of course, had great grudge for what happened to her. And so she brought Milarepa up with this grudge that he would revenge himself on their relatives who'd swindled them in such a terrible, terrible way. So all this we know from Milarepa's biographies. And incidentally, although some of his biographies are a little bit colourful, the ones written a few centuries later, generally the main elements of his life are not in doubt. Where he was born, who he studied with, main things that happened to him. But it's just that later Tibetan writers sometimes elaborated a little bit. So one should be cautious about that. So Milarepa, what did he do for vengeance? Well, what he did is his mother sent him to learn Rothel magic, because Rothel magic, or Tu in Tibetan, it was well known to people that you could learn such things, and you could apply them in negative ways. Sometimes people try to gloss that by saying he must have learnt that from Bumpos, members of the followers of the pre-Buddhist tradition in Tibet, but that's not very likely. Vajrayana brought many, many different magical technologies, and some could be turned to bad purposes. They should be used for good purposes, but with the wrong intention, they can be used in a negative way. So Milarepa learnt those techniques of Rothel practice, and applied them to gain vengeance, which he did by causing hailstorms, and 35 of his relatives were killed. So far, so bad. Yet you see, the thing is that, first of all, we see from that Milarepa's extreme energy and determination and strength of mind. But the fact that he was still within a Buddhist environment meant that he eventually was able to kind of reflect deeply about what he'd done and free himself from his mother's grudge and seek kind of purification of the terrible things he'd done. Because, of course, killing is the most grievous of all non-virtuous actions. No matter what grudges you have, it's done with a mind of violence and hatred. So its outcome can only be the most terrible. In us, Milarepa was frightened of the consequences of his sins, of his non-virtuous action. So in his late 30s, he turned to Dharma. Serious Dharma, virtuous Dharma, moral Dharma. And so at first he apprenticed himself to Nyingma masters, because that was the kind of still in a way the residual religious Buddhist tradition of Tibet was what we'd later on call Nyingma. He sought out different masters. And like Yunten Trojal and so on. And he particularly was fascinated by the teaching of Dzogchen, which is the most profound of the Nyingma teachings, Dzogchen, the Great Perfection. As his masters said, if you learn this teaching in the morning, you can be liberated in that very morning. If you learn it in the afternoon, you can liberate in that afternoon. This struck Milarepa as a good bargain. So he received the Dzogchen teachings. But, and here's another indication of Milarepa's character, he realized he was conning himself. It's not working. That was not true at all. Not that Dzogchen is not a valid practice when taught by a proper master to the appropriate disciple, but Milarepa realized this was not true for him, in his experience. He needed really first to truly repent of his negativity and then find a master whose character was appropriate to someone like him. And then he did. He came across the Lama called Marpa, the translator, because he'd been in India many, many years, studying with great tantric masters like Milarepa and Naropa and others. And he sought him out. Now, of course, part of the drama is, in Milarepa's life story, is that Marpa was a tough cookie, a very, very tough cookie. Although to some of his disciples he was very gentle, perhaps recognizing Milarepa's character, he was not gentle with Milarepa and refused to give him the teachings, refused to train him properly, but kept trying to discourage him. And then also setting him to work, because Marpa was a wealthy landowner by that time and had many, many building projects. So he set Milarepa to work on them. And he did. He went going through great austerities. Of course, in a way that all helped his kind of moral reformation inside. That while his fellow disciples, like Nokchuku Doji and Mitasompa, receiving the precious tantric teachings in initiations of Marpa, Milarepa was building pillars and houses and so on for Marpa, increased this kind of opportunity for reflection and reform, which Milarepa went through. And so even Marpa's wife, the great lady Damema, was not able to soften Marpa towards Milarepa, to give him the teachings. Because Marpa quite clearly realized Milarepa needs this. So there's the big drama between the relationship between the guru and the disciple. Luckily for most of us weaklings, our lamas are not like Marpa, but then we're not like Milarepa. So one shouldn't, what I'm trying to say, caution here, not everybody's relationship with lamas should be modelled on the Milarepa-Marpa dynamic. It was important for Milarepa in that circumstance, that's all. But he's a great example of moral reformation and true devotion to the teachings and true devotion to the Lama as the transmitter of the teachings. So finally he's given the teachings, received Vajrayana initiation such as Chakra and Vajrayogini, teachings on the nature of mind such as Mahamudra, teachings on the completion stage, teachings, the Narotrodha, the 6 doctrines of Naropa, and he goes off to meditate. And then the next part of the drama occurs, where he's meditating in the most austere circumstances. Like I say, Marpa's other disciples, they go home to practice. They go to kind of quite comfortable places and practice there, gain realizations and so on, become important lineage holders. Not for Milarepa. Milarepa goes off into the Everest region and to northern Nepal, into extremely terrifying physical situations, meditating in caves, in great cold, with very reduced food, and so on and so forth. Why? Because it was for him, for his character. Milarepa is an extremist, you see, in a way. Milarepa is a kind of emotional extremist, and therefore his way of training has to be suitable for him. He's come from such degradation, he needs the most forceful training. So he meditates for years in the mountains, in the caves, almost dying from starvation. Not that asceticism is required for Dharma, but for Milarepa's character, it was the right diagnosis, the right prescription. Which is why, for instance, Milarepa, although never becoming a monk, like Marpa was not a monk, Milarepa never took a physical consort, never took a wife, whereas Marpa, of course, did. When he asked about that, he said, well, I'm not Marpa. You know, it was for somebody of Marpa's character, that was absolutely appropriate, but for me, not. So Milarepa is the great yogin, the great ascetic in that way. And inevitably, of course, then the stories and songs, because also another important thing about that makes Milarepa so famous is he did not write texts. He was not a scholarly master, not even a scholarly tantric master like Marpa. He knew enough Dharma to make sense of the teachings he got, but he never studied any monastic college. He didn't study the great philosophical treatises very much. He's a practitioner. And therefore, when he taught himself, it was oral teachings to his disciples, a few initiations and instructions of Mahamudra, and songs. Many of his teachings were spontaneous songs that he composed for his disciples, which would make it easier for them to memorize the teachings, of course. Musically, they're based on the folk melodies of Tibet, Milarepa's songs. But again, he was not a sophisticated poet. He's a folk poet. There's in Buddhist history, there's a sophisticated tradition of poetics. Milarepa was not part of that. He's a folk poet. And so gradually, the news, the rumors of this strange yogin in the mountains, in the Himalayas, in southern Tibet or northern Nepal, meditating, almost turned green because he's eating nothing more than roots and nettles and so on, begin to circulate. And disciples come. One must imagine that, of course, that wouldn't be too welcome initially for Milarepa because he's still dedicated to achieving enlightenment in this life. And we believe he did. He did achieve the level of Vajradhara. He went the whole way along the path. Why? Driven by that same extremism, that same intensity of character, that same one-pointedness of mind that had led him into such trouble. When put in the right direction, it led him all the way. So he becomes, we think, Vajradhara in this life. And disciples gradually come to him. Disciples from men and women or ordinary householders, others who want to become yogins, want to live near him, to emulate his lifestyle, like his great disciple Rechumpa, the little Repa. Repa, by the way, in his name, Mila is his personal name. Repa means the one who wears cotton robes. So cotton-clad Repa, not monastic robes, but white cotton robes of a yogin. So one of his two key disciples is Rechumpa, little Repa, who comes to him as a teenager, and as a wild character, not the same wildness as Milarepa, but wild in the sense that he's disobedient, he rebels, he does this, that, the other, gets involved with all kinds of unsuitable women, leads some of them to Dharma, of course, which is very good. Milarepa did praise Rabbi Shumba, saying, your good looks will bring many people to Dharma. So that's one disciple. Another is Gampopa, the great monk, the great scholarly ex-doctor who becomes a monk and a philosopher. He becomes Milarepa's other key disciple. So it's and the two, and is the one who actually finally carries on the lineage fully. Milarepa dies around about the age of 80. Is he ever reconciled with his family? Well, he goes back, having been several years in the mountain. He goes back to his mother's place, and the house is destroyed, deserted. He finds his mother's bones. So no. And that's it, of course, at that time, which Milarepa celebrated in a very beautiful, famous song about the suffering of samsara. But with his sister Peta, yeah, he is. They are. Well, they never argued, but they're certainly reconciled. Peta, of course, in giving a human touch, is disappointed that Milarepa stays in the mountains. She said, "You don't need to do this as a lama. You can come and live in the towns. Why don't you, for the example of the great master Barilotsawa, he has a nice place, he has attendants, nice horse. Why don't you imitate Barilotsawa, who was a very great master actually? But Milarepa says, that's not for me. I can't do that. He recognized his character and what he needed to flourish and to carry out the Dharma practice and Dharma activity. But yes, so... And his childhood sweetheart, because he did have one, Zese, of course he never marries her, but they're still reconciled. So Milarepa's life story is simultaneously extraordinarily human and extraordinarily spiritual. That's, I think, what makes it so recognizably human, powerful, that it is this. There's a real, beating heart of a human being there who is also a saint, a living Buddha, we would say. So read Milarepa's biography. The one you probably read is the one that's been popularly translated into English a couple of times. It's from the 15th century. My only caution about it would be to say it's better understood as a religious historical novel. The bare facts are more or less true, though some are a bit embroidered, but it's been written 400 years later, and the Lama who wrote it had a particular agenda in writing it, to play up the yogic side of things and to kind of demote slightly the monastic side of things. So, and again, some elements in there, particularly Milarepa's death, are probably not really what happened. So one should be cautious about that.